Welcome to another episode of Mormon Sex Info. I am really excited to have a conversation today about bisexuality. Oftentimes, when we say LGBTQ+, which is kind of the basic way that we talk about this really large group of people with actually very different needs and concepts and thoughts, it's a little bit, I think, of a disservice to those who don't fall maybe in the typical conversation and dialogue that we have. So in other words, what I sense is that a lot of times when we say LGBT, we're really talking about the LG, the lesbian gay population. Bisexuality is something that isn't very much talked about or understood in the general public. And obviously T is its own very different type of issue in the sense that it really has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It has to do with gender identity. So I know that a lot of times trans folks feel very minimalized by conversations that tend to happen under the LGBT umbrella because it's not really talking about them and their situations at all. So today we are going to do our best to at least give the audience an introduction to the B part of that acronym and delve into the world of bisexuality. And what I've done is invited two people who grew up in the Mormon tradition, who identify themselves as bisexual currently, to help us understand, maybe not from necessarily a professional perspective, but from a personal perspective, what's that like? What are some of the misconceptions? What are some of the things that they run up against in overall culture and definitely in Mormon culture? And I'm just so excited to have Nick Stewart and Blaire Ostler for the show. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right. Yeah, I would give you both just a few minutes just to kind of give us, a bit of an introduction. How do you come to have a Mormon background to begin with? And maybe if you want to share just a little bit into your own personal journeys of figuring yourselves out and coming out. I just like to give you each about 5 minutes to be able to do that. So Blaire, do you want to go first?
Absolutely, sure. Yeah, so I'm a 9th generation Mormon. So I come from the pioneer stock. I always joke that no matter if I wanted to or not, I am Mormon nonetheless. So it is the lens in which I view and see the world. It is intrinsic to my identity as my sexual orientation. I'm also a student of philosophy with an emphasis in gender studies and human sexuality. So I really like diving deep into the issues of gender and sexuality and what that means in the context of the human imagination. Growing up, it took a long time for me to label myself as bisexual. While in my youth, during adolescence, I was aware that I was attracted to both boys and girls. At that time in my life, adopting the label bisexual was another whole process in and of itself. So the idea of coming up with a label to identify the experience was tricky because I knew, even though I was attracted to women, that I was still attracted to men. So I knew I wasn't gay, right? So it's like, I'm not gay. I mean, I like guys, but I'm like, oh yeah, I really like girls too. So coming from that experience, it was a much longer process to get around to actually labeling myself. And then even within the bisexual community, there's a lot of struggle over what label is the best and most inclusive. So we have bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, multisexual, polysexual, and all these ideas to describe this phenomena of people who aren't limited to one gender in their sexual orientation. So for someone who comes from a monosexual background, meaning you're either hetero or homo, understanding that sexuality can encompass more than just one gender can take some work. It takes some effort on our part to be able to understand that there is such a thing specifically as biphobia, right? That it's built upon monosupremacist ideas of what kind of sexual orientation is best.
All right. Wow. That was great. A lot of really good information, not just your story, but just as you're talking about your story, obviously delving into exactly what I was just talking about, a lot of the psychoeducation piece on this. So thank you. Nick, what about you? Where do you come from and how do you come to this story?
Sure. So I am my Mormon cred history is not quite as extensive. My parents are both converts. I was essentially born into the church, kind of technically adopted, but putting a label. So I'm almost 40. When I was a little kid, bisexual wasn't like a thing that anyone talked about. It wasn't a thing I'd heard. So I didn't know what it was. So I definitely wasn't that, because I didn't know what it was. I kind of grew up with this, with the normal kind of construct of, boys like girls. And I did. But then I also had heard of people being gay, which was, like guys like guys. So to me, because I also liked guys, that meant I was gay, even though I also liked girls, because I didn't interpret gay to mean not being attracted to girls. It was just they are attracted to guys. And so I kind of used that for myself for a while. But as, I learned more as I got older and other terms came into my vocabulary, I was like, well, that's not really it either. And I learned bisexual and I was like, yeah, that's the one we'll go with. Sure. Because that seems the most accurate. And, as Blaire mentioned, there's a whole kaleidoscope of terms, and bi is the one that probably, because it's the one that was the first one that I kind of hit, is kind of the one I hold on to. But that's kind of the long and short version, mostly short, of kind of where I'm at with that and how I got to that.
Okay, so right away, what you're both really expressing is that in your growing up years, in your developmental adolescent years, you're having the typical struggles that maybe gay and lesbian kids have of questioning their orientation, but it is a little bit more complex in the sense that it doesn't seem so black and white, right? It's not so either or, either I'm this or I'm that. And do you want to speak a little bit about what that was like, in the sense of, did you feel like you had a right to some of those labels, or were those labels helpful, or were they actually limiting, or did you feel like, what's wrong with me that I don't fit into these labels? Like, what was that experience like to have to try to navigate your sexual orientation when there wasn't necessarily a lot of language or narrative around those scripts?
Yeah, for me, in my experience, I actually thought, and maybe I was just very young and naive, I actually thought I was totally normal. I thought it was totally normal for girls to be attracted to other girls and other boys, but you just kind of go with boys because that's what everyone does, right? That's what, your friends are doing. That's what your parents are doing. So you just do that. But I genuinely was surprised when I found out in junior high through conversations with friends that not all girls are attracted to girls. Like, it was genuinely surprising for me, because I thought I was normal. You know what I mean? That this was a very conventional experience. But once I did find out that that wasn't necessarily something normal, and that not all girls are attracted to other girls, that was when I was kind of like, reading other social clues and other social contexts, saying like, oh my gosh, this is a bad thing. This isn't a normal thing. I'm not supposed to like it this way. And people are using the word queer in a derogatory manner. And I'm not queer because, I like boys. So that couldn't possibly be me. So for me, coming to grips with what was going on with me and how it wasn't maybe the normal or average experience affected my ability to have a label until later on in life, because I couldn't find, like what Nick was saying, like bisexual didn't really exist in my vocabulary until I was an adult. It was you're either gay or you're straight. And so for someone like me, I didn't even have the words to explain what I was experiencing. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like the erasure of an experience, because I have no way of communicating that effectively. And if I try to use the words that are already existing, like queer or homosexual, it's like, oh my gosh, that's bad. You're bad. There's something bad about you, and you need to hide this about you. This isn't something you can talk about.
Do you think, before I ask Nick the same question, do you think it's interesting, and I guess I'd ask this of both you and Nick, that you would have thought that it was normal for girls to like girls? In other words, is there possibly a gender discrepancy where we are tougher on boys potentially liking boys? In other words, just in the normal kind of body gestures, there's lots of girls who hug each other, hold hands, or, give themselves body, back rubs. And like you go into any middle school or even elementary school, and there's a lot of physical contact between girls. Do you think that that's, in other words, I guess what I'm asking is, would it have been just as likely for Nick to go into the experience going, oh yeah, I'm sure all boys like boys, but what we do is just we match up with the girls.
Sure, I think that's definitely a valid observation. I mean, from my perspective, and being a woman, the boundaries of woman and woman intimacy is much different than the social boundaries of male and male intimacy. So there is more of that space and flexibility for women to develop these intimate connections up until the point until it involves sex. That's where the cutoff is, right? So I definitely think it's a different experience for guys in our social climate.
Nick, what do you think?
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think that a prime example of that is the fact that, like when I was in high school in the mid 90s, you would have guys that were, really good friends. And if they would do something that could possibly be misconstrued as remotely anything other than straight, it was like, no homo, no homo. Like that somehow made it okay that they hugged each other. So like, it was not normal, like quote unquote normal. Like, it didn't feel like the heteronormative for two guys to hug, even though that seems really crazy to me personally. Like that, it was so, especially with teenage boys. Teenagers are a whole nother animal, but it definitely, even now I see that, I have, tons of friends. Two of my female friends could definitely have more physical intimacy than two of my guy friends, and it would be seen as totally okay. So yeah that's definitely a difference.
I've recently been hearing some real kind of social critique around this for men in general, even heterosexual men, how limited they are in being able to share physical intimacies with their friends. Like you're saying, hugs or touch, which we know we all need, right? And yet we so police that in our culture with all this homophobia that is just so integrated in our system, right? And that actually has an impact on males being able to attach and have, intimacy, whether it's with same-sex or opposite-sex relationships, whether in friendships or romantic relationships, because we limit them so much in those realms. It's really sad, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think along those lines as well, this is a small part of how bisexuals are perceived in general, how female bisexuality is more socially acceptable and permissible, but it also comes with like the sensation of objectification and hypersexuality. You're there only for threesomes and to please, heterosexual couples. To whereas a bisexual male experience, I'm not sure if it comes with that same kind of hypersexualization, but more of the taboo grossness, you're not allowed to do that, bad kind of shameful kind of approach. And Nick can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know the male bisexual experience, but that's my observation.
No, I think that's pretty accurate. I think that, and I can relate it to something that, kind of was said to me when I was younger before I, kind of came to the, bi label myself, but someone in passing had said something about, people that are bisexual just need to pick. They want everything. Like, and they were saying that in that context of like, they just want to be able to have sex with everybody all the time. Like there was that, but that was specifically talking about guys, because the person who said this didn't have any problem with someone who was a friend of theirs who was a female who was actually openly bisexual. And so it was definitely like bisexual guys need to pick. They just want to, have sex with everybody all the time, whatever. But if you're a woman, but I think part of that just goes back to the general toxicity of current masculinity in the world, especially America, because I think that's indicative of that.
Where the messaging, meaning the messaging around masculinity, is that all men just want to have sex and they're not interested in relationships. Right. It's just as long as they can get laid, then they're happy.
Right.
Is that what you're talking about?
Right. Yeah, for sure. And then I think, when you have people who make that, some kind of have like that preconceived notion of what, of like what guys are after, so to speak. And then you are applying that to someone who is attracted to both men and women. That same person is now going to think, well, that guy just, he just wants men and women because it increases the opportunities he has to have sex. Right. Like it's, no longer is he like, he could, like only 50% of the human population, females, are his, target demographic. Now it's everybody around him. Like like everywhere he looks, there is opportunity. And, it'd be nice if it were that easy sometimes, but, yeah.
So let's dive into, because you're also both growing up Mormon. And so you're getting a lot of interesting messages around sexuality anyway, right? And Mormon sexuality is usually taught in a very gender specific way. And it's obviously not really making allowances for any other type of orientation other than heterosexuality. And of course, there's all the purity culture in there as well. So can you give me a sense of what were some of the things that were either helpful or harmful or neutral as you're growing up, not only in our American culture, but also in this niche of the Mormon sexual education system?
For me, I think that partly because I was in California and not in a, predominantly Mormon area, church stuff was fairly secondary for me, especially because I came from a place, because of my family situation, my dad being African-American and my mom being white, and therefore me being biracial and all of the things that come along with being a Black person in the church. The sex stuff was kind of minor for me with church. I heard all the same normal messaging that, probably everyone else heard, but because I was in coastal California, it wasn't quite as, insane as some of the stuff that I hear in Utah, for example. So I don't think that for me, it was fairly common. And I don't know that I heard anything at church that didn't seem fairly common to what my non-Mormon friends at school heard in their various churches, or in some cases just families. So I don't think it was too different for me.
So meaning that you feel like your Mormon upbringing was a little bit more open-minded, or at least not as rigid or punitive in the sexual realm.
Yeah.
Okay. And I also want to point out too that I think that, if you're saying that you're in your 40s, those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, this was prior to all the rhetoric that we currently hear at church, specifically against LGBT folks. I mean, it's not that we were any less homophobic, but we weren't talking about it, it's just become a very much a part of the vernacular these days, I'd say in the last decade or two. And we didn't necessarily hearing a lot about that. Would that be?
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair. But I also think part of it is that the church didn't need to talk about it because this was like AIDS crisis height, right? So AIDS was this thing that was scaring everybody. Gay people are spreading gay disease. That was the rhetoric in the culture. And so the church didn't need to say much because people in general were already kind of freaking out. So I discrimination. So I think, right, exactly. So I think that the church didn't have to worry too much about that, and that at that point, because there was enough general panic about it that they didn't need to go the way they've gone since.
Yeah. So Blaire, what would you add to? How was your maybe experience different with the
actually my experience in a weird way was kind of similar because I grew up in Seattle, Washington area, which is pretty liberal anyway. And so even the church and my friends and the people I were hanging out with were relatively more open-minded and accepting of certain things. I mean, I don't want to paint it as this Berkeley utopia or anything. It wasn't like that, but it was definitely probably more liberal than the mainstream church's attitudes about sexuality. So for someone like me, I would definitely agree with what Nick was saying. In some ways, we didn't get as much of it at church, the condemnation of homosexuality, because we didn't need it because everybody else was already condemning it. So it was just kind of like this thing that, oh, look, we all agree homosexuality is bad. To whereas now the church is taking an active stance against it because cultural shifts are changing. Yeah. Growing up as well, and again, I did not have the typical Mormon upbringing. I grew up in a relatively sex positive house. And I think in a weird way, because as a girl growing up in the church, you're not allowed to have a sex drive. You're not allowed to have desire. You're not allowed to have wants. What you are is you are the gatekeeper to men's sexuality. It's a very heteronormative model. It's very Puritan culture, and you are the gatekeeper. Your desires don't matter. It's his desires that matter. And so in a weird way, assuming that girls don't have desire or girls don't, have sexual fantasies or anything like that, I was never told explicitly and oftenly that something like masturbation was wrong. So when I masturbated as a youth, I never felt bad about it because no one ever talked to me about it because people just assumed that girls didn't have a sex drive. And so in this weird way, I was like kind of ignorant in a good way that protected me from a lot of harmful sex culture. So the sex culture that took place was really something that I don't know if I was just like, no, I'm not going to listen to that, or if it just wasn't so pronounced in my face, or if I was just kind of like, what you're saying is wrong. I don't know if I could put an exact pinpoint on the experience, but in some ways it was better growing up thinking that, you know, I'm not this sex crazed animal, because being treated that way would have definitely given me a different experience with being bisexual.
What age group are you in as far as when were you going through teenagerhood? What decade?
Oh, so I was a 90s kid. I'm a millennial.
Okay. All right. So let's move then into, you know, as you've got an audience in front of you that maybe doesn't know a lot about bisexuality, you know, in general, let's say, what would you want an audience like mine to know as far as what are some typical misperceptions? What are some things that maybe bisexual populations are dealing with? What are ways that the privileged population doesn't even consider certain aspects of bisexuality, right? So what are some kind of basic concepts that you'd like to share?
Oh my gosh, I have so many. I don't even know where to start. Nick, do you want to go first?
So sure, why not? So I think that one of the big ones for me, so I am married to a woman. And so I think for me, when I started coming out to people like as an adult, I would tell people and they'd be like, oh, well, it doesn't matter because you're married. Like, you're already married to a woman, so it doesn't matter. And I was like, well, that's kind of not true. Like, it matters. It's part of who I am. Like it's me.
Yep.
I understand where they're coming from, but I don't agree with that. Right. Like, I understand that to them, the perception is that I've picked now. I have now picked females. I've married a woman. So I have picked to be straight, which of course is not true. But the fact that somehow I am not bi anymore, or it doesn't matter that I am, is kind of, well, it's not kind of, it's very, very dismissive and it's rude.
That's very sex-centric to me. In other words, like, people are like,
yeah.
Oh, the anatomy that's going together is female and male, so therefore that's what's currently happening in this long-term marriage. We don't have to identify this person as anything but heterosexual if they're in a opposite sex relationship, right? So is that a fair statement, that it seems very sex-centric instead of orientation-centric?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that in my experience, it seems like it's pretty common for bisexual people to be identified based on the gender of the person who they are currently in a relationship with.
Got it. That's right. And Blaire, you were saying yes.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Nick is saying, that is a big way that bi-erasure is basically the neglect, ignorance, or denial of the bisexual experience. And that is one of the biggest ways that when bisexual people do enter into a relationship, whether it be hetero or homo monogamous, all of a sudden their bisexuality is just gone. Like, it's just no longer existence. And so it makes your orientation determined upon behavior. And so whoever you're having sex with, that's your orientation. And so in a weird way, bisexuals aren't afforded the same orientation privilege, that label privilege that other people are. Because if you think about it, if you have a kid who's never had sex, but he knows he's attracted to girls, well, he can't call himself heterosexual until he actually has sex with a girl. And so there's the whole, you're not bisexual unless you're having sex with both sexes at the same time in different, and it's just kind of like, it goes down this spiraling abyss of like, I'm sorry, my sexual orientation isn't always going to be determined by my behavior, because whether I'm single or in multiple relationships, I'm still bisexual no matter what.
That's right.
I mean, if I were to clarify some other misconceptions too about bisexuality, there's this whole idea of bisexuals are never straight enough and never queer enough. And no matter what they do, they're never going to belong to either category because they're half homo and they're half hetero. And I really don't like this idea because it assumes that bisexual people are only having half an experience. We're not whole. We're not full. We're not part of any communities. And so we can easily be lifted up and lifted out of certain communities. And that can be one of the reasons why, I don't know, a lot of people don't know this, but bisexual sexual orientations exhibit the highest scores of depression, anxiety, and suicide ideation. They are just behind the trans population. So bisexuals suffer a great deal from this idea of like, I don't belong anywhere. I'm not a full person. I'm not having a whole experience. I'm only half of this group and half of this group. And people can just cut up my sexuality and then assign it to me without regard to how I'm feeling or how I'm experiencing it. Along with that, I'd also add the idea of sexual fluidity. There's no single way to be bisexual. Every bisexual is going to be so different. Like some people might consider themselves only attracted to like a handful of people of the same sex, or some bisexuals might consider themselves only attracted to a handful of the opposite sex. And so some bisexuals are fluid, and I consider myself a bisexual fluid. There have been times in my life I thought I was entirely a lesbian, and times in my life I thought I was entirely straight. And I was able to come to terms and make peace with my sexual orientation once I realized I'm just bisexually fluid and I don't have to pick a side. I don't have to pick a team. And you know what? I may want chocolate cake one night and creme brulee another night. That doesn't mean I'm confused about what I want. I just want a different thing, a different night. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to get it, but it does mean I'm not confused about what I am. I'm not confused about what I like. I'm just bisexual. I'm fluid. And that is just as legitimate as a fixed monosexual sexual orientation.
Going back to one of the points that you made about, not feeling like you're whole, isn't it true? Would you both agree that oftentimes bisexuals feel discriminated against both by the heterosexual community and also by the homosexual community?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, I know.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Because I think I think that the homosexual community is super tolerant and wonderful and accepting, right? So go ahead, Nick, can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I kind of come to this with the sort of like extra layer of I'm also biracial. And so this is something I've experienced as someone who doesn't seem to always find a home with white people and doesn't always seem to find a home with Black people. And now, and I'm also bisexual. So, straight folks are kind of like, and gay folks are like, so I spend my life in this like middle zone of, kind of skepticism on either side that I'm not really one of them, which is fine. I'll just live in the middle. Like, that's cool. There's a lot more middle anyways. But yeah, so, I know that, so I think the skepticism from like, straight folks, I think kind of goes back to what we kind of talked about already about, just sort of like this idea you have to kind of pick one or the other. But that also kind of comes from the other side too. Like, I've had, gay guys who don't want to be with a bisexual guy because they don't like men anymore and they're going to run off with a woman instead. And like, yeah, but anyone could leave. Like, that's not because I'm bisexual. It would be because I found someone that I like better. Like, that has nothing to do with me being quote unquote in the middle. But yeah, no, it's definitely you go to like a gay pride event, and up until fairly recently, sexuality was like non-existent there. Speaks volumes, I think, despite the fact that, B is in that whole alphabet soup acronym. Much like trans folks, we often get overlooked in that regard.
And can I say too that there can be a bit of almost like you're making an excuse, like you really don't want to come out, especially I think for bisexual men. Isn't it kind of this idea, they say they're bisexual, but what that really means is that they're gay and they just don't want to own it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that part of that goes to, and I don't even want to say I think, because I've seen people respond this way, that I don't want to put myself out there to be gay, because being gay means being marginalized by, the rest of the world. And so, for me, if I say that I'm bi, then I can, pretend to be straight and I can pass, but, I can still be, attracted to guys and, whatever. And I just find that ironic that, the homosexual community would say that, would sort of have like that mentality of, well, they're just trying to pass, they don't want to be, like we're trying to avoid being victims, but like they're literally victimizing us at the same time. Right. And this is something that is, a person of, who is biracial. I experience the same thing, like in that regard as well. Right. Like I have Black people who think, well, he just hangs out with white folks because he's trying to be white, or because that's just the people that are my friends. And this, again, it just affects me on these multiple levels. But yeah.
Yeah. We're really uncomfortable with things if they're not necessarily on one side or the other. Right. Which biraciality and also bisexuality, I think bi would be more of a nuanced identity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything from you, Blaire, in regards to just discrimination from the homosexual community themselves?
Yeah, I would just agree with what Nick is saying, and also add that I think sometimes there's an erasure of the experience of like internalized homophobia and internalized trauma of being a homosexual, because bisexuals are homosexuals and we are internalizing that trauma and that things like that. And just because we're attracted to heterosexually too doesn't erase the fact that we're still dealing with and internalizing that homophobia that we were taught from day one too. It feels like sometimes from the homosexual community that like, oh, because you weren't completely homosexual, going back to that whole parts again, you're only part homosexual. Mm-hmm. You're not as much subject to that trauma. You're not subject to the same amount of like phobias and shame rhetoric that, I was subject to. And it's like, no, I was subject to all those things too. Just because I'm bi doesn't mean that I don't still have that experience happening to me. And while I don't think it's a good idea to get in the oppression Olympics of like, who's more oppressed than who, but I do think that we should acknowledge, no, we're all dealing with homophobia here and the internalized shame that we were taught from our youth. So just being bisexual doesn't mean that mine's somehow less than yours. So the other thing I would say about rejection within the queer community also is, Nick touched on it, this idea of like passing privilege. And so because a bisexual person may benefit from passing privilege, all of a sudden that they aren't dealing with, again, homophobia and internalized issues of shame. Passing privilege also comes with the idea of bi erasure. If I'm passing as straight, you're ignoring the fact that I am bi and having a bi legitimate experience. And so erasing that experience somehow makes it harder to get help, to get compassion, to get services for the things you are experiencing. So the passing privilege in some ways also functions as bi erasure, meaning your experience doesn't count because it's not visible for everyone to see and judge.
Yeah, that's good. So what else? Anything else as far as just kind of educating folks in regards to, hey, maybe this is something you haven't thought of in regards to bisexuality, or something that we want to make sure you're aware of?
Listen, be a good friend and just listen. If you don't understand the experience, or if I feel like sometimes that when bisexual people come to people in the queer community or the straight community to talk about their experience, there's so much of this, we want to fix it. We want to cheer you up. We want to make it better. And it's kind of like, you know what? I just need someone to listen right now. I need someone to hear the experience. And even if you can't validate the experience, don't try to invalidate it either. You know what I mean? Just find something that you can identify with or you can sympathize with and focus on that aspect. Just don't try to fix me. That's the worst thing. Like I for me personally, that's one of the worst things I've experienced as a bisexual is people constantly wanting to come in and explain my orientation to me and fix me. And I'm not in the market right now looking for someone to fix me.
Mm-hmm. Nick, anything you would add?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, I think that a lot of the time, the same sort of, advice that one would give to someone who has a person who comes out as gay, or a person who, really any of these various things that is, quote unquote, against the norm. It's, like Blaire said, it's like, listen to people, And it's like, just take care of the things that you're saying, right? Like when I was very young, before I knew before I identified myself as bisexual, my mom said at one point, I'll never understand bisexual people. They just need to pick, right? And so like, she wasn't saying that to her. That was just what she knew. But it's those sorts of things that like people say that they don't always think about how that's going to affect other people. And, it's like when someone says, oh, it's just because you haven't found the right girl yet. To me, like, well, no, I've found some on both sides. We're good. And as married to a woman, I have found the right woman. Thank you very much. But, it's just that sort of just like, I mean, with everything in life, just like use caution in your words, especially when someone is coming in. It's definitely not the right time to, necessarily issue platitudes like, well, you just haven't found the right, a female, or all those sorts of things are just not appropriate. It's like, listen, and like say, I'm sorry, like what can I do to help you? Like, like what can I do to be a good friend for you right now? In that regard, it's really no different than so many other different things that people experience in their life when they have that moment of trying to, open themselves up to you. It's being able to, allow them to comfortable enough to open up that part of themselves to you, and you to be the good friend and to be the, to be there for them, because, like Blaire was saying, there's nothing wrong with us. Like, we're not broken. We're not like, we don't need fixing. This is just who we are. And when, when we come out to you, like, we are opening that part of ourselves to you because we think we can trust you with that. So
one of the things that I think I've heard on several occasions is this whole attention seeking kind of idea. So, well, isn't that a convenient way to not really come out as gay, but you still get all the attention, about the coming out process. So do you want to, either one of you want to speak on that?
Yeah, definitely. So I've received some criticisms in that regard because I do have passing privilege because I am married to a man. And, it's really funny. It puts bisexuals in this double bind, right? If we're open and explicit about our sexuality, we're accused of seeking attention or hypersexualizing everything. But if we don't talk about who we are and our sexual orientation and identity, we're accused of being dishonest. We're untrustworthy. We're going to leave our partners. So no matter what the bisexual does, they're put in the double bind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If I talk too much about it, I'm wrong. If I don't talk enough about it, I'm being dishonest. So at some point, you just kind of have to live your life, and there's going to be naysayers, but you just have to be true to yourself. And I know that sounds trite, but it really is true. Like, you really just have to be true to yourself, be true to the people you love and your friendships, and just be honest about who you are and your intentions. I think there's also this, and maybe Nick could speak to this differently than I would, as him being a man and me being a woman. But as a woman, there's also like these kind of accusations of, oh, you're just bi for the male gaze. Like, you're just bi because guys like it when girls are bi. Well, newsflash, not all guys like it when girls are bi. And second of all, I'm not bi for the guys. I'm bi for the ladies. So to reduce my sexuality for something for the male gaze is just playing into the same patriarchal oppressions and culture that feminists are fighting. And so to put that on the bisexual woman, like, you're just seeking attention, you're dishonest, and no matter what you do, it's just like, you know what? People are going to hate, and I just got to be kind and just be myself.
There's a lot of messages, I think, that Black folks also receive in regards to sexuality. I think oftentimes our culture over-sexualizes Black people. Nick, do you want to speak to that at all in regards to this context of bisexuality? Do you notice that there are also messages that you're having to deal with in regards to being biracial and also bisexual?
While I'm certain they exist, I think that because of the various circumstances for me, including not really being out until I was married and, quote unquote, an old person, I think a lot of that stuff I sort of circumvented in relation to being bi. I know that, there's a whole, there's a whole slew of stuff, specifically as far as Black people, African American people. There's, a lot of really unhealthy stereotypes about things like that, the jungle fever and dingo sorts. And I know that, I think that, the idea of, finding like a couple finding a bisexual person, although that tends to be, a bisexual woman, to be, the third party, in some sort of tryst is very common, more so, like really way more so than it should. I have not found that for myself as a guy, but again, I've been passing, so to speak, as straight for a really long time. So, until after I was married. So it became, so that's been less of a thing for me personally.
Okay. Can we move quickly then into Mormon specific stereotypes, messages, narratives that you now see? Maybe, neither one of you grew up in a super Mormon centric or Mormon rigid environment, but as you've become more aware of bisexuals within the Mormon community and how they're struggling, what would you have to say as far as just some of the rhetoric and narratives that we have in Mormonism that either are harmful or helpful to bisexual members?
The church has long had, these sort of, if someone's gay, then, they need to find the right, they need to find the right opposite gender partner, and then they'll be okay. That is obviously ridiculous. But I think that being bi, for folks who actually understand bi, they see that as a potential like glimmer of hope, right? Like, well, they're bi, so they could find the right, in my case, woman, and then they'll be straight, it'll be fine, right? And I feel like it gives this like quote unquote glimmer of hope that, will be normal if we find the correct opposite gender partner, which, I understand where they're coming from. Again, I think it's kind of ridiculous because it shouldn't be about trying to make someone who they're not. It should be about that person being happy, regardless of whether that's with a same gender partner or an opposite gender partner.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And going along that point that Nick just made is also this idea of don't allow people to use bisexuals in any way, showing how hetero relationships can work for queer people, because bisexual person entering into a mixed orientation marriage, though comes with trauma, is not the same as asking a gay person to go into a mixed orientation relationship. So one thing I try to do as a bisexual and a member of the church is to nip that in the bud right away. Anybody who ever tries to use my bisexual experience, and maybe I overstep my bounds, anyone else's bisexual experience, to try and convince a gay person that this is a way to make it work is so troubling. Nip that in the bud right from the start.
Do you believe that that's what's happening on some of these, for example, the Mormon and Gays website, and they'll have videos of mixed orientation marriages? Do you think that there are components of bisexuality for people who are making those marriages work and be functional that are not being addressed, and that people just don't even understand that that's a component?
I think that's definitely possible. I don't know how much I can speak with like any kind of certainty to that, but I definitely see, at least on an anecdotal level within the church, this idea if bi people can make it work, gay people can make it work. And I think you're right. There is a lot of like maybe not acknowledgement that maybe some people who are gay or straight do have maybe a little bit of bisexuality or fluidity within themselves that are making these relationships work that just doesn't go acknowledged. So that definitely could be the case. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to me, because to me, orientation is really not remotely binary, right? I mean, it's a spectrum. Even people as straight, a lot of them have attraction at some level to people of the same gender, perhaps. So I think that because we oversimplify this to begin with, I think that it makes it that much easier for folks who, because we've gone with this really simple, binary description of things, has a bit of, said, well, I'm a little bit this, so I must be all that. So now they're saying I'm gay. And then something happens, they end up, because they're coerced or whatever, the church tells them that's the right thing to do. They end up marrying someone of the opposite gender and it works out. well, is not because they were gay and marrying an opposite gender person really worked, or because they were really bisexual, but because bisexuality is not viewed as like a thing by so many people still. They identified as gay because that was, of the two options, that seemed the closest, but they were really, and so of course, yes, they were able to make it work because they're actually bisexual. They married someone they are actually attracted to.
Right.
Gay, it's that they were bisexual.
I think this is such an important part of the conversation, especially with the current expectations of the church being that gay and lesbian people either stay celibate or only, have heterosexual sexual relationships. So I think that gets conflated a lot for sure. So, all right, well, that's really interesting. You mentioned, Blaire, some really staggering statistics regarding depression, suicidality, suicidal ideation. So can we spend the last few minutes here doing one of two things? One is maybe, what would you hope a parent or a mentor or a friend of somebody who is coming out as bisexual would be able to offer? And also, what thoughts would you have for bisexual members themselves in regards to offering support and resources, et cetera?
Yeah, definitely. So for the ally, for the person hearing from the friend or a parent or child or whomever that they're coming out as bisexual, the first thing you can do, for me, that has been the most helpful to me, is the validation of the experience. One, just acknowledge that the experience is real. You don't even have to, accept the experience without a moral supposition on the experience, without understanding the experience, right? So just admit that the experience exists. Don't pretend it's not there. Don't pretend it's going to go away. Then from that point, if you can, accept and validate the experience, that you don't need fixing. You're going to be okay. And with that, it's a matter of, when I came out to my mom, she said the best thing ever. She said, honey, God made you perfect just the way you are. And I couldn't have been more validated by something from that experience, just knowing our religious background and knowing her religious background. And so that something like that coming from my mother, like that in and of itself does wonders for depression, anxiety, suicide ideation. The other thing is my husband accepting my bisexuality and being supportive and understanding of what I'm experiencing has been so huge. So if you're the ally, support, listen, understand, validate, and if you can, just say, I don't understand, but I want to, so please help me understand. Have some humility. They're talking to an experience that you don't have, so come into the situation with humility. For the person coming out, the bi person, so one thing I've had to do for myself is which I know this might sound like lowering the bar, but I don't see it that way. It's setting realistic expectations for yourself. You're coming at queerness from an angle that defies homosexual and heterosexual conventions. You're coming at this from a place that not everyone is going to be understanding or empathetic to. So if you're going somewhere to a place where I'm like, I need help, I need sympathy, I need understanding, you know what? Maybe your straight friend or maybe your gay friend isn't the best person to do that. Find a support network of people who are going through this experience with you. And so when you do have those downtimes, because you're going to have those downtimes where you just feel like, oh my gosh, even the straight people in my life who love me so much cannot understand this. Like they're not getting it. They don't want to hear it. I talk to my gay friends. They don't get it. But if you have some other people in the bi community who you can talk to, just even if it's one other person to be like, I'm looking for sympathy and validation on this. And 9 times out of 10, like in my experience, the bi person is there to be able to, validate the experience and say, yes, you're not crazy. No, you're not confused. I am experiencing this too. You have a valid and legitimate experience happening to you right now. And I have found so much support in the Mormon queer communities. Mormons are so great because we build communities like it's no one's business. So when someone comes out as gay, it's like, well, we better start a community. Okay. Queer. Yep. Let's start a community. Let's do a bi community. So for me, like the Mormon queer communities have been so helpful. So like people at Affirmation, Mormons Building Bridges, like these have been really helpful communities for me. I know In Circle's doing a lot of work. And so reach out. Don't be afraid to get involved in these communities. And I know it can be hard, it can be difficult, but like there's love and acceptance waiting for you. You just have to find it in the right places. And if you need someone, PM me. I'm on Facebook. PM me. I'll put you in contact with people. Just keep the hope.
That's awesome. Nick, what would you add to all of that great stuff she just shared?
I think that all of that is really good. I think that the one thing I would add is that not necessarily, like, don't wait until someone comes out to you to, educate yourself on the subject. I think that that's the easiest way for people coming out to have better experiences, is for people, for them to not to be coming out and then have to do all the education themselves. People, when there are more people who already, have done some work and understand even basics, it makes it that much easier for people to come out, because more people will at least, believe you, will at least understand some aspect, as opposed to how you having to go through everything with them. I think that, we see it more now with, people coming out as gay. There's, homosexuality is so much more, present in our, openly in our culture. And obviously there are still some horrific stories of, when people come out. But I think that you see people who are able to come out because they have loved ones who have had more experiences with people who are gay, and they see that it's not necessarily the evil, scary river that they were taught. And that's honestly part of why, even though I can pass and I hate labels, I tell people that I'm bisexual, right? Like, it matters that people understand that I'm bisexual. I'm normal. I mean, relatively compared to, normal people. I'm a normal person. I'm happy. Like, it's important that people see that, and that they don't just assume straight guy, because that makes me a person who can provide, I'm an example of what a bisexual person in real life is. That's great for, might not have a concept of it to begin with. And it's great for people who are trying to figure out if they can come out or not. And if they run into me and they're like, oh wait, Nick's bi, then maybe they'll feel comfortable and they'll want to, talk to me about it. That's cool. But I think that it's hard, right? Because it's hard to come out in the first place. And then especially when you're in a position like I am, being passable, so to speak, like I'm married to a woman, nothing about, something not straight, but there's no reason to look at me and assume anything other than Nick's a straight guy. But I think that's dangerous, because it makes it even, again, this goes back to the bi erasure thing, right? Like, bi people just don't exist. Nick's, Nick's not bi, he's straight. So I'm bisexual, even though I hate labels, generally speaking, right? But yeah, I think people just need to educate themselves on the issue. And, I think you'd find a lot more being comfortable coming out to more people if they didn't have to feel not only scared what the reaction would be, but also how to do the work for the other person and doing all the education about what that really meant.
Well, I love all of your points, and I think that's really important. Like, I would hope that, this, for example, a podcast like this that will have something about bisexuality, in its title. And I hope people don't just pass it over, right? Oh, well, that doesn't apply to me. So these podcasts are really opportunities for people to obviously educate themselves or find resources if they are going through something personally. But I totally agree that a huge part of listening to these podcasts is just self-education on the human experience. And you never know when you're going to have somebody in your, Sunday school lesson, or somebody in your ward or stake, or somebody in your friends group, or your children's friends group, or your child, that is struggling. And I would just, if I would add anything to what both of you have said, is that don't assume you're talking to heterosexual people.
Yeah.
I think that's what we do at church. We just assume we're talking to a bunch of heterosexual people, and we otherize these, so many members who are on the spectrum of some type of fluid orientation or, really do identify in some type of label that is not heterosexual. So I do think that we need to just become more, especially those of us with privilege, which means we are heterosexual in a, heteronormative community. We have that responsibility of educating ourselves so that the minorities can feel safer and can feel more supported. And we, some of these statistics that we see that are so drastic can hopefully decrease over time as we have more resources. So thank you so much for everything that you've shared. Is there anything I didn't ask or that I didn't bring up that either one of you feel would be important to make sure we touch on?
No, I think that was really great. This is my first time meeting Nick too. Nick, I want to be your friend. Like, let's hang out sometime. You're good people.
I like Nick.
I'm all right.
Yeah. Nick had issues.
I'm only okay.
He's so cool. And I have actually really enjoyed meeting you both. Briefly, I wish I had, I wish I lived closer to people that I think are super interesting and cool and we could hang out. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your time and energy. And I do think this is a really important topic. I'm so glad we're talking about it. Please, if you're a listener, consider sharing this resource with people that might benefit from it. Become a subscriber if you're finding these podcasts valuable. I am looking at making some of the archived podcasts available for free so that more people can access them and so they can become more shareable. So I will be looking at that as a potential future project. But in the meantime, I need the support financially to be able to make this podcast sustainable. So thank you to all those who either purchase the podcast or subscribe to the yearly subscription. Blaire, Nick, please have a wonderful weekend and day. And thank you so much. I hope our paths cross again soon.
Likewise. Thanks,
Natasha.
All right. Good night. Bye-bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go. All wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.